The little alien girl gasped as her small escape pod spun wildly through space. The bright blue and green planet below grew larger and larger, filling the window. She pressed her trembling hands against the glass, her heart pounding. This was not how it was supposed to happen. Her name was Zyra, and she was a Taveri, a delicate, light-boned species from a peaceful, low-gravity world called Velos. The Taveri had never known real danger. Their planet had no predators, no natural disasters, no sickness. Life was gentle, and so were they. But now, Zyra was falling. Her family's research ship had been traveling through an unknown sector of space when something went terribly wrong. A strong gravitational force pulled the ship off course, sending it spiraling towards the strange planet below. Zyra's parents had barely managed to place her in the escape pod before everything turned to chaos. She remembered her mother's soft voice. "Stay safe, my little star. We will find you." Then the door closed, and Zyra was alone. The escape pod roared as it entered the planet's atmosphere. Flames licked the sides, and the whole pod shook violently. Zyra clutched the straps of her seat, her fragile body unable to handle the force. Her vision blurred. The pod was spinning too fast. She felt sick, dizzy. Then, with a loud boom, everything went dark. Zyra woke up to silence. The pod had crashed. Smoke curled from the wreckage, rising into the sky. Her head ached, and her thin arms trembled as she unfastened the seat straps. Everything hurt. Carefully, she pushed open the hatch and crawled out. And then she saw it. This world, it was wrong. The sky above was a deep, endless blue. The ground beneath her was hard and covered in something rough and green. Trees, taller than any building she had ever seen, surrounded her like silent giants. The air was thick, too rich with oxygen, making her dizzy. Strange sounds echoed from the darkness between the trees. Howls, rustling, chirping. She shivered. She could feel the danger here. On Velos, nothing hunted. But here, something was watching her. Zyra turned her head sharply. In the distance, she saw eyes. Glowing, golden eyes peering from the shadows. A creature, low to the ground, with sharp teeth and fur, crept forward. It moved slowly, cautiously, its powerful muscles tensed. Zyra didn't know what it was, but her instincts screamed. Run. But she couldn't. Her legs were weak. Her whole body was too fragile for this place. The creature stalked closer, lips pulling back into a silent snarl. Zyra knew she was about to die. Then the ground shook. A loud, terrifying bang filled the air. The creature yelped and darted away, disappearing into the trees. Zyra turned her head sharply, her whole body frozen in fear. There, standing tall against the light of the setting sun, was a monster. At least, that's what she thought at first. It was massive. Twice her height, covered in strange, thick armor. Its arms were bulky, its legs powerful, and in its hands was some kind of weapon, still smoking from the blast that scared the creature away. But the most terrifying part, it had eyes like fire. Not actual fire, but something fierce burned in them. A sharp, intelligent gaze, a look that said it had seen many battles, faced many dangers, and won. Zyra's breath caught in her throat. This creature, this giant, had no fear of this death world. It had mastered it. The giant took a step forward, lowering its weapon slightly. Zyra flinched, stumbling backward. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. She had never been afraid like this before. On Velos, there was nothing to fear. But here, everything was a nightmare. The giant tilted its head slightly. Then, in a deep, rumbling voice, it spoke. "You're not from around here, are you?" Zyra didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It wasn't like the growl of a predator. It wasn't a sound of hunger or anger. It was curiosity. The giant took another slow step forward, reaching out a hand. Zyra panicked. She didn't know what to do. This creature was too strong, too fast, too powerful. If it wanted to, it could crush her in an instant. She did the only thing she could. She fainted. Zira slowly opened her eyes. Her whole body ached, but at least she was alive. She was lying on something soft, softer than the hard ground where she had crashed. A rough, thick fabric covered her small body, warming her against the cold air. For a moment, she thought she was back home. Maybe it had all been a bad dream. Then she saw it. The giant. It was sitting nearby, poking at a small fire. The flames crackled and flickered, casting strange shadows across its face. Zyra's heart pounded. She remembered the glowing eyes, the loud voice, the massive frame. She had never seen anything so terrifying. This world was already a nightmare, and this giant, this creature, was part of it. She tensed, her fragile fingers gripping the fabric around her. Was she its prisoner? Did it plan to eat her? She had read about predators before, but only in old stories. The Tevari had no real predators on their world. They had never needed to fear being hunted. Now, Zyra felt like prey. The giant turned its head. Zyra froze as its burning eyes locked onto hers. It said something in a deep, rumbling voice. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the feeling. It wasn't growling like the beast from before. It wasn't making an attack sound. It was speaking. The creature moved, reaching for something. Zyra flinched, but it didn't grab her. Instead, it picked up a small metal cup and held it out toward her. Steam rose from the top, carrying a strange but warm scent. She stared. The giant was offering her food. Zyra hesitated. Was it a trick? Did it want to fatten her up before eating her? The giant sighed and took a sip from the cup itself. Then, without a word, it placed the cup beside her and went back to the fire. Zyra blinked. It wasn't forcing her to take it. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and touched the cup. It was warm. She lifted it to her lips and took a tiny sip. The liquid was strange, bitter but not unpleasant. It spread warmth through her small body. Her hands still trembled, but she didn't feel as afraid anymore. Zyra studied the giant while it worked. Now that she wasn't in immediate panic, she could see things more clearly. The creature was humanoid, with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head like hers, though it was much bigger. It had rough skin, not soft and smooth like a Tevari. Its hair was dark, short, and messy. It wore thick layers of clothing and armor, making it look even more massive. And its hands. They were big, rough, and covered in scars. Hands of a fighter. Who was this being? And why had it saved her? The night passed in silence. Zyra couldn't sleep. She was too afraid, too overwhelmed. Eventually, the giant stood and motioned for her to follow. Zyra hesitated. Should she trust it? Did she even have a choice? If she stayed here, another predator might find her. She was too weak for this world. Slowly, she stood on shaky legs. The gravity was still too strong, making movement difficult. She stumbled. The giant sighed, then did something that made Zyra's breath stop. It lifted her, gently, carefully, as if she were made of glass. She stiffened, waiting for pain. But it never came. The giant's grip was firm, but not crushing. It carried her easily, as if she weighed nothing. Zyra had never felt so small before. She wanted to struggle, to protest, but exhaustion won. Her head rested against the giant's chest, and she heard something strange, a heartbeat, a steady, strong rhythm. For some reason, that sound made her feel safe. She didn't understand why. The giant carried her to a cabin hidden in the trees. It was a strange structure, made of wood and metal. It looked hand-built, rough but sturdy. Zyra had only ever seen cities made of smooth metal and glowing glass. This place looked old, like something from a primitive world. The giant stepped inside and placed her on a strange, soft platform, a bed. Zyra's hands gripped the edge as she watched it move around the room. It lived here. Was this its home? The giant removed some of its outer armor, revealing more scars underneath. Deep, old wounds. Marks of battles fought long ago. Zira shivered. This creature had survived many fights. It wasn't just strong. It was a warrior. The giant turned to face her again. It pointed at itself and spoke a single word. Jack. Zira blinked. Was that its name? It pointed at her next, waiting. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, in a small, trembling voice, she whispered, Zira. The giant, Jack, nodded. For the first time, Zira felt something other than fear. She didn't understand this world. She didn't understand Jack. But maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. Zira sat on the soft bed, her tiny hands gripping the thick blanket wrapped around her. The warmth of the cabin felt strange, too heavy, too real. Everything around her was solid, rough, and built for a creature far larger and stronger than her. The wooden walls, the heavy metal tools on the table, even the large mud Jack had given her the night before, everything reminded her that she didn't belong here. This was a death world. And Jack, he was one of its masters. She glanced at him cautiously. He was sitting near the door, fixing the strange object. His large hands worked skillfully, twisting and tightening parts with ease. Zira still couldn't believe it. Hands so powerful, capable of crushing things, but also able to build. She had never seen anything like him before. Jack caught her staring and raised an eyebrow. You good kid? Zira tensed. She didn't understand the words, but she recognized the tone. Curious, but not threatening. Slowly, she nodded. Jack grunted and went back to his work. Zira let out a breath. This giant, this human, could have crushed her, could have left her to die outside. But instead, he gave her food, warmth, and safety. Why? She didn't understand. A loud noise made Zira jump. Jack sighed and stood up, stretching his arms. He grabbed a strange long object, his weapon. Zira had seen it before, when he scared away the predator. Now she watched as he slung it over his shoulder and walked toward the door. He glanced back at her and pointed to himself. Hunting. Zira tilted her head. Hunting. Jack thought for a second, then made a claw gesture with his fingers and pretended to bite the air. Zira's blood went cold. He was going to hunt predators. Her body stiffened. The idea was terrifying. On Velos, no one hunted. There was no need. Food grew easily, and no creature attacked another. But here, the strong hunted the weak. And Jack was the strongest thing here. He saw the fear in her eyes and sighed. Relax, kid. I'll be back. He opened the door and stepped outside, closing it behind him. Zira stared at the wooden door for a long time, her heart pounding. This world was so different. She didn't know how much time passed, but the waiting made her nervous. The silence of the cabin was too loud. Her ears picked up strange noises from outside. The distant howl of a beast, the rustling of leaves, the wind whispering through the trees. She shivered. What if Jack never came back? What if something stronger than him was out there? The thought made her stomach twist. As much as he frightened her, she didn't want to be alone. Then, finally, Thuti. Zira jumped as the door swung open. Jack stepped inside, carrying something over his shoulder. It was huge, covered in fur, and completely lifeless. A predator. He had killed it. Zira stared, unable to believe her eyes. The beast that had looked so terrifying in the forest now looked small compared to Jack. He dropped the creature on the floor and wiped his hands on his pants. Damn thing nearly got me, he muttered. Zira didn't understand his words, but she understood the meaning. The predator had been dangerous, even to him. But he still won. Jack looked at her and smirked. See, no big deal. Zira swallowed hard. For her people, this would have been an impossible situation. For Jack, it was just another day. Later, Jack started preparing the meat from the creature he had hunted. Zira watched, both fascinated and horrified. The idea of eating an animal was strange to her. On Velos, they only ate plants. But here, Zira realized, nothing was easy. Jack needed to hunt to survive. Everything here had to fight. Even the plants outside were tough, their roots gripping the ground tightly, their leaves thick and strong. This world did not give anything freely. Zira was starting to understand. Earth was not just a dangerous place. It was a place where only the strong could live. And humans? They were not just strong. They were built for this world. That night, Zira sat by the fire, deep in thought. Jack handed her a small piece of cooked meat. She hesitated, but the rich smell made her stomach growl. She had barely eaten since she crashed. Carefully, she took a small bite. It was strange, but good. Warm, filling. Jack grinned. Not bad, huh? Zira didn't understand the words, but she nodded slowly. She looked at him again. The giant from the Deathworld. Maybe he wasn't just a monster. Maybe he was something more. And maybe if she wanted to survive here, she had to learn from him. Zira woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The warm blanket, the rough wooden walls, the scent of burning wood. It all felt so different from the soft, clean air of Velos. Then she remembered. Earth. She sat up, blinking in the dim morning light. Jack was moving around the cabin, gathering supplies. He had a large bag slung over one shoulder, and his weapon rested against the table. His movements were quick, efficient. He was preparing for something. Zira watched him, her small hands gripping the blanket. Every action he took was filled with purpose. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. This was a man who had spent his entire life surviving. Jack glanced at her and nodded. You're up. Good. Eat something. We got work to do. Zira tilted her head. She still didn't understand his words, but his tone was clear. He wanted her to get ready. Jack placed a small piece of food in front of her. It was simple, rough, but filling. Zira hesitated, then took small bites. She was still getting used to Earth's food. Jack sat down across from her, watching. After a moment, he tapped his own chest and said, "Strong." Then he pointed at her and shook his head. "Weak." Zira frowned. She understood that. She knew she was weak. The gravity of this world made every movement difficult. Her bones were too light, her muscles too soft. If she had been alone, she wouldn't have lasted a single day. Jack leaned forward. "If you want to live here, you gotta be strong." Zira didn't need to understand the words to know what he meant. He was going to teach her. The first lesson. Jack took Zira outside. The air was cold and fresh, filled with the sounds of the forest. Tall trees surrounded the cabin, their branches swaying in the wind. Zira shivered. She had never been in a place so wild before. Jack led her to a small clearing and stopped. He pointed at the ground and said something. Zira didn't understand, but she knew he wanted her to stand there. She did. Then Jack picked up a small rock and tossed it at her gently. Zira flinched and barely caught it with both hands. It wasn't heavy, but even that small weight made her arms ache. Jack smirked. Pathetic. He picked up a bigger rock and tossed it to himself. Then, with one hand, he threw it across the clearing. The rock slammed into a tree with a heavy thunk. Zira's eyes widened. Jack pointed at her again. Throw. Zira looked at the rock in her hands. It felt heavy, but she tried anyway. She pulled back her arm and threw it forward. The rock fell to the ground just a few feet away. Jack sighed. Yeah, we got work to do. Zira clenched her fists. She felt small, weak. She didn't like it. Jack saw her frustration and grinned. He picked up another small rock and placed it in her hands. Again. And so, the lesson began. Days passed. Every day, Jack made Zira train. She lifted small rocks. She walked around the cabin, trying to move faster. Jack even made her push against his hand to build her strength. At first, it was impossible. Her body wasn't made for this world. But Zira was determined. She wasn't just some helpless alien girl. She didn't want to be a burden. So she tried. Again and again. Her muscles ached. Her body screamed in protest. But slowly, very slowly, she improved. She could throw a rock farther. She could move faster without falling. She could even stand longer without feeling dizzy. Jack never praised her, but she noticed his small nods of approval. That was enough. A new threat. One evening, as Zira was carrying a small bundle of firewood, she heard a noise, a low growl. She froze. Her heart pounded as she turned her head. Eyes. Golden, glowing eyes. A predator. It was bigger than the one from before, with sharp fangs and a long tail. It watched her from the shadows, waiting. Zira knew she should run, but something stopped her. Jack had taught her to be strong. Running wasn't strength. Her small hands clenched into fists. She forced herself to stand tall. The predator took a slow step forward. Then, bang! The air shook as Jack's weapon fired. The beast yelped and flowed into the forest. Zira turned, her heart still pounding. Jack stood a few feet away, his weapon smoking. He walked over and looked down at her. "You didn't run." Zira didn't understand the words, but she saw the small flicker of pride in Jack's eyes. She hadn't run. For the first time since arriving on Earth, Zira felt something new. She felt brave. Zira could feel it. The change. Her body still ached, her muscles still protested, but she was stronger than before. She could walk longer without feeling like she would collapse. She could lift heavier objects without her arms trembling. She had come to Earth as a fragile being, unable to survive on her own. But now, she was learning. Jack had taught her how to carry things, how to move faster, how to be aware of her surroundings. Every lesson made her more ready for this world. But Earth was not a world that let things happen easily, and it was about to test her again. The hunt begins. Jack woke Zira early that morning. The sun had barely risen, but he was already preparing. He slung his weapon over his shoulder and motioned for her to follow. Zira rubbed her eyes sleepily but obeyed. She had learned that when Jack wanted something done, it was important. He led her into the forest. The air was crisp, and the scent of damp earth filled Zira's nose. Birds chirped in the distance, but otherwise, the world was silent. Jack stopped and crouched low, pointing at the ground. Zira knelt beside him, curious. Tracks. Large ones. She shivered. Something big had passed through here recently. Jack tapped the tracks and looked at her. "Hunt," he said simply. Zira understood. Jack was going to hunt this creature, and he wanted her to watch. The Deathworld's law. They followed the tracks deeper into the forest. Jack moved silently, his steps careful, controlled. Zira did her best to copy him, but she wasn't as good. Then, Jack suddenly stopped. His body tensed. Zira's heart pounded as she followed his gaze. Ahead, near the trees, was the creature. It was massive, bigger than Jack, with thick muscles and long claws. It had a deep scar along its side, probably from another battle. Its golden eyes gleamed in the dim light. Zira swallowed hard. This wasn't like the smaller predator from before. This thing looked like it had never lost a fight. Jack exhaled slowly and raised his weapon. Zira held her breath. Then, crack! The gunshot echoed through the trees. The beast roared, its body twisting in pain. But it didn't fall. Zira gasped as it turned toward them, its eyes now full of rage. Jack cursed and fired again. The second shot hit, but the beast was already charging. Zira's body locked up. Run, run, run. But Jack didn't run. Instead, he stood his ground. At the last second, he dodged to the side, avoiding the beast's massive claws. It skidded across the dirt, but before it could recover, Jack aimed and fired again. Bang! The beast let out a final pained growl before collapsing. Silence fell over the forest. Zyra's legs felt weak. She had been so close to death. Jack, on the other hand, was completely calm. He exhaled, slinging his weapon over his shoulder. Then he looked at Zyra. "You freeze, you die," he said, tapping her forehead lightly. "Remember that." Zyra didn't understand the words, but she understood the lesson. This world didn't forgive hesitation. The fire inside. That night, Zyra sat by the fire, staring into the flames. She replayed the hunt in her mind, the danger, the power of the predator, and the way Jack had faced it without fear. Zyra clenched her fists. She had been helpless. Again. But she didn't want to be helpless forever. Jack had shown her that humans weren't just strong, they were unbreakable. They didn't give up. They fought, no matter the odds. And if she wanted to survive here, she had to do the same. A new lesson. The next morning, before Jack could wake her, Zyra was already outside. She stood near the clearing, gripping a small rock in her hands. Jack stepped outside and raised an eyebrow. "You're up early." Zyra didn't understand the words, but she lifted the rock and threw it as hard as she could. It didn't go far, but it went farther than before. Jack smirked. "Not bad." Zyra turned to him and nodded firmly. She wasn't done learning. The Deathworld was changing her, and one day she would become strong enough to survive it. Zyra stood at the edge of the clearing, gripping a wooden stick in her small hands. The morning air was crisp, the sky painted in shades of soft orange. She took a deep breath and swung the stick forward. Whoosh! It cut through the air, unsteady, weak. But she did not stop. Again and again, she repeated the motion, trying to mimic what she had seen Jack do when he hunted. Her muscles ached, but she welcomed the pain. It meant she was changing. Jack leaned against a nearby tree, arms crossed, watching her struggle. His sharp eyes followed every movement, analyzing, judging. "Too slow," he said. Zyra exhaled sharply. She still didn't understand most of his words, but she knew what that meant. She wasn't good enough yet. Jack stepped forward and pulled the stick from her hands. "Watch." He moved with precision. His swing was fast, sharp, efficient, his stance strong. The ground beneath his feet barely shifted. Zyra's eyes widened. It wasn't just brute strength. There was a technique behind every move. Jack handed the stick back to her. "Try again." She nodded. And so, the training continued. The Deathworld tests her again. Zyra was still practicing when she heard the rustling. Her ears twitched. Her body froze. Something was watching them. Jack noticed it too. His expression changed in an instant. He reached for his weapon and scanned the tree line. Then, a shape leaped from the shadows. Zyra barely had time to react before it was on her. A wild predator, smaller than the last one, but just as deadly. Claws flashed, teeth snapped. She felt her body moving before she could think. She dodged. The beast missed, landing on the dirt beside her. It growled, golden eyes burning with hunger. Zyra's heart pounded. She gripped her stick tighter. Jack raised his weapon, but before he could fire, Zyra attacked first. She swung with all her strength. Crack! The stick hit the beast's face. It wasn't strong enough to kill, but it was enough to stun. The creature yelped, stumbling back. Jack didn't waste the opportunity. Bang! The shot echoed through the trees. The beast collapsed. Silence. Zyra stood there, breathing hard. She had fought back. Jack lowered his gun, then looked at her. His lips curled into a smirk. Not bad. Zyra understood that. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from excitement. For the first time, she had not just survived, she had fought. The fire in her heart. That night, Zyra sat by the fire, staring at the burning flames. Jack tossed a piece of roasted meat onto a wooden plate and slid it toward her. She took it, still deep in thought. She had never imagined herself fighting a predator, never imagined winning. But she had. Jack leaned back in his chair. "You learn fast." Zira tilted her head. She understood only a few words, but she could guess what he meant. She had changed. She wasn't just a weak alien girl anymore. She was becoming something more. She looked down at her hands, her fingers tightening into a fist. She wasn't as strong as Jack. Not yet. But someday, she would be. The fire crackled beside her, warm and bright. And deep inside her chest, a new fire burned. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple. Zira stood outside the cabin, gripping the wooden stick that had become her weapon. The wind brushed against her face, carrying the scent of earth and wood. She had changed. When she first arrived on Earth, she was weak, barely able to stand in the heavy gravity. She had relied on Jack for everything. But now, she could run without falling. She could lift without shaking. She could fight without fear. Jack had taught her many things, but today she would face her biggest test. Because something was coming. And this time, she wouldn't have Jack by her side. The Deathworld never rests. Jack had left earlier that morning, heading to a nearby river to gather supplies. He had told Zira to stay at the cabin. She understood the order. But as the sun sank lower, a new danger arrived. The forest went silent. Zira's eyes darted around. The birds had stopped singing. The insects had stopped chirping. Something was wrong. Then she heard it. A low, deep growl. Her body tensed. She turned toward the trees and froze. Two golden eyes stared back at her from the shadows. A predator. But not just any predator. This one was bigger than the last. Faster. Stronger. Smarter. Zira's grip tightened around her stick. Her heart pounded. The old Zira, the weak Zira, would have run. But not this Zira. This Zira stood her ground. The battle begins. The beast charged. Zira's instincts screamed at her to move, and she dodged just in time. Claws swiped through the air where she had been standing just seconds ago. She swung her stick, aiming for its face. Crack! The beast flinched but didn't stop. It turned, snarling, and lunged again. Zira barely managed to roll out of the way. Her body ached, but she ignored it. She needed to be faster. The beast circled her, golden eyes filled with hunger. It was waiting for her to make a mistake. Zira gritted her teeth. No, she wouldn't lose. The creature lunged a second time. This time, Zira didn't dodge. She stepped forward. The move surprised the beast. Its momentum was too strong to stop. And that was its mistake. Zira ducked low and jabbed her stick into its side. The predator yowled in pain. Zira jumped back, breathing hard. She had heard it. But it wasn't over yet. The beast turned, furious. It swiped at her again, and this time, its claws connected. Pain exploded in Zira's shoulder. She stumbled, falling to the ground. Her vision blurred for a second. The beast loomed over her, ready to strike the final blow. Zira's fingers tightened around the dirt. She wasn't done yet. She rolled to the side just as the beast's claws slammed into the ground where her head had been. Using the last of her strength, she grabbed a nearby rock and threw it. Thunk! The rock hit the beast's eye. It screeched in pain and staggered back, giving Zira the opening she needed. Ignoring the burning pain in her shoulder, she grabbed her stick again. With one final burst of strength, she struck its head with everything she had. The beast let out a final snarl before collapsing onto the dirt. Zira stared at it, panting. It was over. She had won. A warrior is born. The pain in her shoulder was sharp, but she didn't care. She had faced the Deathworld and survived. Jack returned not long after. When he saw the dead beast and the bruises on Zira's body, his eyes widened. "You did this." he asked, stepping closer. Zira wiped the sweat from her forehead and nodded. Jack looked at her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. A real smile. For the first time, Zira saw something in his eyes that had never been there before. Respect. You're not weak anymore, he said simply. Zira didn't need to understand the words to know what he meant. She had come to this world as a helpless girl. Now she was a survivor. Now she was part of the Deathworld. And nothing would ever stop her again.